So good morning, everyone. This is Kirti Mutatkar, the President and CEO at United Ag, and I would like to welcome all of you to today's webinar. I know there is a lot of information going on, lots of newsletters, and everybody, including from retail or anybody we associated with, there's a lot of COVID-19 related information coming our way. So it's really hard to sift through that and understand what's really important and what's really relevant to our industry and what we need to do. And that's the reason we wanted to have this webinar today. From a federal standpoint, there are a lot of issues going on related to the COVID-19 crisis. And we have been talking to Chris Schulte and Lynn Yaquez from CJ Lake. They represent United Ag and our membership. So they've been keeping us informed of everything that's going on and offering us solutions and tools for our ag industry. So we wanted to hold this webinar today for our membership, so all of you get a chance to listen to Chris present and talk about the federal issues related to COVID-19 and also give you a chance to ask questions. So feel free to ask questions because this is an opportunity for all of you to get some of the answers that we've all been waiting for, because like I said, there's so much confusion out there. And Chris, we are looking to you to present, and maybe some of the things that we hear, you clarify some of the things, what's really true and what's not, and what we need to do in this crisis that is going on right now. So with that, Chris, you have the floor, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining in this morning. With everything going on, we appreciate you taking time out to join this and to learn more about all that's going on. Some of it is still evolving. We're getting information from minute to minute out of all the different agencies involved. There's a 1,000-page bill that passed last Friday, and people are still trying to unpack everything that's in there, and $2 trillion flowing out of the government. So obviously there's a lot to be figured out around that. United Ag is very, very useful on both fronts, kind of providing information to you, but also conveying your concerns back here to DC. And so to the extent that you're seeing issues or the loan programs we talk about out of SBA or out of the Department of Ag aren't meeting your needs, or there are questions that haven't been answered yet by the guidance, please, by all means, it's a two-way street to kind of get that information, and we can take it to the agencies and try to solve problems on this end as well. So these are the two bills that have been the biggest change so far. And so we're on day 15 since the first one took effect. It seems like 3 months ago, but it was actually only 2 weeks. That's the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, sometimes called FFCRA. You'll see that in the presentation. Sometimes we'll just call it the Families First Act. That was signed by the President back on March 18th, and it takes effect today. So this is perfect timing to learn about it. Today is the first day where the paid leave provisions in there in particular will kick in. And then the second was just signed last Friday. That's the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act. That one contains $2 trillion with 12 zeros there, $2 trillion in relief. And for our purposes, there's some tweaks to the family leave provisions, but perhaps just as importantly, all the loans that come out from SBA and the Department of Ag. So 4 main things that we're paying attention to here. There's the paid sick leave requirement, that's new. There's the paid family leave requirement. The good news for both of those is that there's federal funds to cover that. So it's not money that is just only coming from the employers. That will be paid back from federal dollars, dollar for dollar. There's a notice requirement that applies to everyone that the law covers. So all employers with 500 or fewer workers will have to post this notice whether or not you have people that are on sick leave or family leave. It essentially alerts the workers that these are available. So if they meet one of the conditions, then they should approach you and report that. And then there's the loans and grants that are coming out to help in this time of need. So for Families First Act, we'll start there. Fewer than 500 employees. Sounds straightforward, but with seasonal businesses in particular, and particularly businesses that engage with others to meet some of their labor needs, so farm labor contractors and so forth, that's where the devil's in the details. It gets a little bit confusing. So first is that the number of employees, it's taken as a snapshot. So it's at the time that the leave is taken. That's what determines if you're covered or not. So if there are times of the year where you're, maybe have fewer workers and then times where you go over 500, it's looking at it at that time. It's not an average. And they don't separate part-time and full-time, and they don't separate H-2As from U.S. workers. So it's anybody who's an employee. So it's a little bit different than what we're used to for things like the Affordable Care Act, where they have full-time equivalents. So if you had, say, 2 workers doing half shifts, that would count as 1 employee for ACA coverage purposes. Here, they're each an employee. It's basically how many individuals do you have on payroll on that day. So no exceptions for seasonal employers, but again, it does adjust depending as your workforce grows and shrinks over the course of the year, perhaps. And it's anywhere in the U.S. So if you have different operations going at the same time, if you're growing in Salinas and growing in Yuma at the same time, something like that, it would look to both of them. If you have related companies, they use what they call an integrated employer test that already exists under FMLA. So people in determining whether you're covered for Family Leave Act already, not the paid leave, just sort of regular family leave, it will look to that kind of, is there shared ownership, shared management, kind of centralized control? Do you have kind of a central payroll office that serves multiple companies? So if there are family members that own in different combinations 3 businesses, it's possible that they could all be combined, and that would add up. So, and then the key for farm labor contracting is this joint employer test. And so it's tricky in California, where under California law, they're treated as joint employers no matter what. Just as a matter of law, a grower and a farm labor contractor are each liable for penalties and wages. It's a little bit different, and they specifically say in the DOL guidance that they're using the federal standard, so not the California standard. So it could be that if you use a farm labor contractor, those are not your quote-unquote employees for purposes of the Family First Act. They really are looking to your direct employees. And so this will come up later in the presentation where we talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, where there's funds from the government to cover your payroll. It's looking to people that you are paying directly, not necessarily people that are working at your operation, but just people that you pay that are your employees. That's the test for that. There is a very, very partial small business exception. A lot of people latch onto this, but it's very narrow. So we'll touch on it to the extent that it applies to anybody, but it's very limited. Again, so it's operations with fewer than 50 employees, and it's only an exemption from the extended leave, that 12 weeks of leave we'll talk about in a minute, for where the employee's children, the employee's son or daughter has a school closure related to COVID. And so even within that, the business can be exempted from that and not have to provide that extended leave to that worker, to the extent that providing that leave and being without that worker would essentially cause them to suffer losses that would shut the business down, or the absence of the worker or workers that are covered would pose a substantial risk to the business or basically prevent them from operating. As we'll talk about, since the money comes from the federal government ultimately, being without the worker itself, having to pay the leave isn't a financial loss to the company because that's reimbursed directly by the federal government. It's more that that's an essential person, and if they were without them, they would be shut down. So it's not going to apply in very many cases, but just to kind of put it out there, if that does apply to you, that's something to look into more closely. This might be the most important slide of the group. So these are the 6 factors that would trigger paid leave. And so the key is that the employee is unable to work or telework. So if there's some situations, if, for example, if you have somebody who does your bookkeeping or payroll, they're home taking care of their kids because their child's school is closed, but they're able to do it on their computer at home, that would still be eligible. They would still be able to work, so they wouldn't get the paid leave for that time. They would just keep working. The idea is that they are completely unable to work whatsoever. And so for agricultural operations, you can't telework to pick strawberries or to work in a greenhouse. You have to physically be there. So that's the more common situation for this. But and it looks to we'll talk about it a little bit later. But the idea of an intermittent schedule, if people are on some days, off some days, it's tied to the specific day that the worker would have been expected to be there, but for one of these conditions. That the only reason they can't work is because of one of these things. So number 1, they're subject to a government quarantine or isolation order. And so some questions around this, because you have things like in California, you have the stay-at-home order from Governor Newsom. That's not the same thing. So it's not just kind of a general order. Most agricultural operations right now are considered essential services, so they're exempt from that anyways. But to the extent we have anybody that's not, that's treated differently. So basically, if you are shut down, your workers are not able to come and you can't continue operations, the solution that the government is suggesting is just to have a temporary layoff for those workers during that closure time. They would be eligible for immediate unemployment benefits up to 100% of their pay. So they would take that. So it wouldn't be handled as paid leave because they're technically laid off for that period, and then they could start back up with you immediately. This is in particular somebody that essentially is COVID positive and they are under state or local health order to remain closed in. So the idea of quarantine is a term that CDC uses. That means somebody who has been exposed to somebody who's COVID positive and then they're in observation to see if they develop symptoms. Isolation is they have tested COVID positive and they are themselves in isolation so they don't infect others. We are hearing that some local governments are imposing a 2-week quarantine for workers, H-2A workers who come into the country. So when they first arrive, they have to remain essentially in lockdown almost for 2 weeks so that they keep an eye on them to see if they develop symptoms, and only then are they cleared to go to work. We have questions into DOL as to whether that A, if that counts as a quarantine so that you'd pay your sick leave for that period under this category 1, pay them at that sick leave, be reimbursed by the government, and then after that they would go to work and that would exhaust their 2 weeks for the rest of the year. Or if they're considered not to have started working until they complete that 2 weeks so that they would essentially not be paid for that time period. So to figure out just to make sure. And for a lot of these, if they're interpretive questions, DOL is the key because for 2 reasons. 1, they enforce this to make sure that you are doing it correctly. And 2, they are part of the process with IRS to determine if you get reimbursed. So you want to make sure that there aren't workers who should have been paid and weren't, but also make sure that if you're paying and they say it doesn't qualify, potentially you don't get reimbursed for that. So there's some flexibility that we'll talk about, but they're kind of the decision maker on this process. Number 2 is straightforward. It's a doctor orders health quarantine. That's somebody that's COVID positive specifically. Any other quarantine or kind of medical treatment for any other condition would not be covered under the paid leave. So if they have something else going on, that's not it. This is specific to this unique diagnosis. 3, they're exhibiting symptoms and they're currently seeking a diagnosis. So it's not, you'll notice that one of the things that's come up but is not included as one of these is somebody who does not have the symptoms, they've not tested positive, but they're concerned that they're going to get it if they come to work. That's not included here, so you would not get paid leave for something like that. Number 4, this is where the gap between 3 and 4 here is when you shift from paid sick leave to the paid family leave provisions. 4 is you're caring for somebody who's quarantined who has tested positive. And so it's not limited to family member. The use of the term individual is a little bit of a departure from usual FMLA. So under the Family Medical Leave Act currently for unpaid leave, it looks to different relationships, you know, spouse, son, grandparent, parent, something like that. Here it just says individual. 5, caring for a child whose school or daycare is closed. Again, here they use the term child, or they actually use the term son or daughter. So if you have a grandparent who is the primary caregiver for their grandchild and the school is closed, they technically wouldn't be covered by the Act. It's specific to that parent-child direct relationship. It includes adopted children, stepchildren, but it is son or daughter is the language that's used there. And so that, again, it's family leave. That is actually subject to a longer period, as we'll talk about. And number 6 hasn't been defined yet, but is more to the extent, you know, if things change, then the Secretary of Health and Human Services can announce other conditions that would be triggered. But so far, those have not been announced. So far, 1 through 3 are kind of grouped together, that someone has decided that you have the disease or you're currently testing to make sure that you do have it. That's 1, 2, and 3. 4, caring for somebody who is, that's straightforward. And then 5 is the kind of closed school scenario. For sick leave, so again, these are categories 1, 2, and 3. Each employee is entitled to 2 weeks at their regular rate of pay. So 2 weeks or up to 80 hours, whichever you hit first. So we'll talk about a little bit later how that's calculated, but that's sort of, the 2 are used interchangeably, but it's essentially one or the other. And so those are the specific conditions that would trigger that. They're quarantined by the government or doctor. or they're being tested. And so there's a daily max payment that would come with that, up to essentially 10 working days. So that's why for all these, it's basically 10 times the per day is the per worker limit. And then family leave, this is paid only at 2/3 pay. Sick leave is at 100% of pay. Family leave is at 2/3 pay. And so that's if they're caring for someone or if the school is closed. And so for the schools closed scenario, they would have the option to use paid time off. So essentially they would get full pay for the first 2 weeks by using up their sick leave or annual leave if they wanted to, but then the remaining 10 weeks would just be covered at the 2/3 pay from that point forward. And so there are some limits that the worker, to qualify for that 10 additional week period, needs to have been with the company for 30 of the last 60 days. So if somebody just shows up, they can't go out and get 10 weeks of pay. They needed to have been with you for some amount of time. The CARES Act clarified that it wasn't just the last 30 days, because if somebody had been laid off for a period but had completed time before that, they looked to that full 2-week period going backwards from when they start taking the leave, which for most people would be now because the schools have already been closed for a while, obviously. Let's move forward. For part-time workers, if this is the situation, it's provided based on their average number of work over a 2-week window. And so you figure out what kind of an average day would be, and then that's what's paid. So it wouldn't be the full 80. Maybe they only average, say, 50 or 60 hours over any 2-week window. That's all they would get. So it's 2 weeks or 80, whichever you hit first. If their schedule varies a lot, they don't have kind of they're on Mondays and Thursdays and that's it. But it comes and goes depending on how they're used. You can look back over a 6-month period to figure out what their average daily hours would be. Or if they haven't been there that long, then essentially what is the arrangement that was in place when they started. And that applies for either sick leave or family leave. You know, a part-time worker wouldn't get the full 80 hours because they wouldn't have been there. That's not the reason that they weren't at work. They would never have been at work, so they only get up to what they would have expected to get. Calculating pay, you use the actual scheduled hours to figure this out. So say you had a worker who was scheduled to work 50 hours a week. You're still subject to the 80-hour maximum within 2 weeks. So they would get paid for 50 hours in week 1, they would get paid for 30 hours in week 2, and then that's it. Still subject to the caps, the daily caps of 511 for the sick leave or 200 for that 2/3 pay family leave provision. There's no time and a half on this. It looks like it's tax-free, so the payments are no withholding is taken on that. There's an open question we're still trying to figure out with California as far as how if this pay is considered wages essentially, so that it account toward the employer workers' comp premiums as kind of a payroll cost. I think it's all being considered outside that. So it's done through the normal payroll process. They would get a paycheck saying, you know, you are being paid for whatever 40 hours this week of paid sick leave, but that's not necessarily wages. And again, it's reimbursed through the federal government anyways. And as far as figuring out the regular rate of pay to figure out how to pay them, for people that are on a piece rate basis, say they're paid per by the bucket or by output, how many plants they plant or something like that. You can use that averaging over 6 months to figure out what their effective average hourly rate is. That doesn't include things like discretionary bonuses or perks or anything like that. There's guidance for other purposes from Wage and Hour a few months ago about regular rate of pay that made clear that those are not to be included. Here's some other rules around the paid leave. So again, it starts today. So if somebody has been out for a week already, you wouldn't have to pay for that. That's separate from that. And so it runs through the end of the year, hopefully, knock wood that this is solved well before that, but it's currently set up to run this year, and so it's for leave taken going forward from today. If the company is closed for some reason, this is what we talked about, whether there's a stay-at-home order or government shutdown, then that is not paid leave. Or if the government shuts down going forward, say somebody is a week into their 2-week period, and then a week from now, the company has to close down. Just customer demand isn't there, or government orders it, whatever happens. The workers would switch to unemployment insurance from that point on. So It's only for periods where they could have come into work because the company was up and running and they were expected to be there on that day. If the company is closed or even there are layoffs and they're included in that, they wouldn't get paid for that. They would just switch to the unemployment coverage. This is sort of a little footnote of it. You know, if you have fewer than 25 employees and essentially the position no longer exists when they come back, the worker comes back from the leave, it's not necessarily that you've shut down or you've laid that person off specifically, but just sort of the position isn't there. There's not a requirement to rehire them. It's pretty narrow. That won't apply to most people. And then it's a combined period. The 12-week is a total. So say somebody's home for sick leave for 2 weeks, but then their child's school is still closed, then they could stay for the other 10 weeks on the paid leave. It doesn't stack. So it's a 12-week limit. And so also if you have somebody who's sick, they use 2 weeks of leave, but then they would be caring for somebody on top of that. Again, it's one or the other. It counts. Those weeks are used through whatever form they're used in, that's it. If somebody's on variable shift or intermittent or is able to telework, again, it's only when they would have physically been there but for the qualifying event. So say there are two parents that split childcare duties, and so they're able to come in 3 days a week each. So they are paid for their work for those 3 days, and then they would get paid leave for the other days, you know, say 2 days out of the week when they would have been there but are at home. They would get that 2/3 pay for those other days. Here's some of the other provisions. It doesn't make regular FMLA leave into paid leave. This is specific to COVID. So if it's not one of those conditions, FMLA still exists. Say somebody has a baby and they would be out for leave. FMLA requires you to keep their job open for them for a period of time if you're covered by the act, but it doesn't require pay that wouldn't have been required a week ago before this took effect. This is in addition to state leave requirements. In California, for example, there's already a paid leave requirement. It's on top of that. It doesn't preempt the California rules. There's a prohibition against terminating a worker for taking the leave or complaining about how they're treated about it. Makes sense. I mean, there's an anti-retaliation provision in there. So in the scenario we talked about, where there are layoffs and that would end the duty to provide the paid leave, you want to be very careful about kind of if the whole business closes because of a stay-home order or something like that, that's straightforward. It's not personal to that worker. It's just you were forced to shut down. But even if there's a situation where you're laying off a quarter of the workers or something like that, you would want to show why that worker was included in the group that was laid off so that it wasn't retaliating against them for taking the paid leave. And again, it's not the employer's money, so there's nothing gained by laying them off. You know, you're not going to be paying for that anyways. It's just a question of whether they get federal funds as in the form of paid leave or they get federal funds in terms of unemployment. If for somebody that's home caring for their children, they're at 2/3 pay for that period, it may be to their advantage to be laid off, to take advantage of the unemployment. But again, you want to be careful on how that is handled, that you're very flexible with the workers and careful about that so that you're not running afoul of the Department of Labor on this. IRS has indicated that they are going to have, they're suspending some of their enforcement activities right now, and DOL has specifically said that they are in a 30-day, quote, non-enforcement window now. So essentially for the month of April, they will not impose civil money penalties if an employer gets it wrong. So they should have paid somebody and they didn't. They'll say, okay, well, the first time you get one free mistake, basically. So you go back, make the catch-up payments to the worker, but we're not going to impose penalties. We want to kind of teach you how to do it correctly, and then we'll move forward. People that have been through wage hour audits know that that is not how they normally do business, so that's good news. And then speaking of good news, there's federal money to cover this. So the government will pay for this leave dollar for dollar, up to the limits that we talked about, the 511 per day or 200 per day. Most people, that's not going to be an issue. And so the first way to handle this is money that you would normally be sending to the government on a quarterly basis for FICA taxes. That's 6.2% of earnings per worker. Instead of sending it to the government, you can just turn that around and use that as paid leave. And it's not worker by worker. It's not each person's 6.2%, because obviously that would never be enough to catch up to their 100%. It's the total amount that's paid in. So if you have 100 workers and only 1 or 2 are out, you'll be fine. H-2As don't pay FICA. So if you have a workforce that's heavily H-2A, that might not be enough. And in that situation, or just if for whatever reason you have too many workers out for that to cover it, there will be tax credits and there'll be money coming back from IRS to make up the difference. Their goal is to get that out within 1 to 2 weeks of when you ask for it from them. And there's actually DOL is talking about a program to do advances of money so that federal dollars would come even before you're paying the leave so that you'll be ready to go. You'll have cash on hand to push out to people in that payroll period to cover that paid leave. And again, it's all employees are covered. So that's, regardless of immigration status, whether they're H-2A, however they came to be in the country. We've all completed I-9, so the understanding is that your workers are legal as far as you know, so everybody is eligible for this. There are no specific limits on that. And then within companies, if it's owned as an S corporation, and so the owner of the company essentially gets money out of the profits of it but isn't paid as an employee, they would not be eligible. But if they are listed as a wage employee and they get a W-2 for their compensation, potentially they would if they needed to take one of these forms of leave as well. So moving on, more good news, more ways that the government is helping to pay for workers, which we always like to hear. So this is in the CARES Act. This is one that was just signed last Friday. This is part of that $2 trillion package. There's about $350 billion in there to cover this Paycheck Protection Program specifically. The money is available through private lenders. There is a website for SBA, so if anybody's gone on that and tried to apply, you'll see that there's a box that you have to check to move on that says you are not a farm. That doesn't mean that you're not eligible for this. That's specific to disaster loans. Those are separately available from USDA right now on better terms, frankly. Growers, ag groups will get better terms for that than people that just go through SBA that run kind of, retail or offices or something like that. So it's not that you're ineligible for any of it because you're ag. There are no exclusions for ag for any of these. The opening of the PPP here will be Friday, April 3rd. That doesn't mean you have to apply right away, but obviously a lot of people will, so there could be some bandwidth limitations on the website. And so the application form is available from the Treasury Department now as far as kind of what needs to be shown for that. It must be used to cover payroll, includes paid time off, compensation, other things that go with that. You can request up to 250% of your average monthly payroll. And so essentially, if you use the money and you can show that you've retained your workforce over an 8-week period, the loan is forgiven. So it essentially is a grant, really. So to the extent that there's any amounts that are not forgiven, you got more in than you were able to give out as payroll because some of the workers had to be let go or so forth, then that money would have to be paid back. But it's at fairly low interest rate and payable over time with deferments kind of built in that you can kind of extend that payment out. But for most people, if your business is up and running and keeping roughly the same number of workers, it will all be forgiven, and so it's free money from the government to cover payroll. Here's some of the other provisions in there. There's Section 7A loans through the Small Business Administration. Those are covered by a $5 million max. The 504 loans, micro loans are, tend to be very small for specific things for small businesses. That's less likely to apply for most of you. They have the EIDL loans I mentioned, low interest rates, but again, the USDA loans here at the bottom, that's the key. The Department of Agriculture received about $9.5 billion to push out to farmers. And so we were working with them. We were on the phone with them late last night on this exact issue. So keep an eye on, and they're supposed to be updating their website. Part of the confusion was that SBA changed their website before USDA did, and so the information that came out was a little bit off balance. But USDA should be updating their website. It's farmers.gov/coronavirus. We'll have the information as they start rolling that out. It may not be live right now as we talk about it, but there's a website there, but the specific information about how they will be pushing out that $9.5 billion should be there. And so that will cover things like lost income, the economic injury issues like that. It's not clear yet that they would have a specific parallel program to the Paycheck program that would cover ag worker wages, but again, you're eligible for it through the SBA, through Treasury, So that's how that's handled through the Treasury Department instead. So to the extent that you're seeing losses that are not otherwise covered by any of these loan programs, that's a perfect example to kind of bring to United Ag, and then we can take that to USDA and say, look, we have growers that are suffering losses that are hurting here because of XYZ. We need you to use some of this money to cover that, or adjust the eligibility requirements, or adjust kind of what is a qualifying loss to trigger that. And that's something that we can take to them. And so with that, rather than just hear me talk the whole time, if there are any questions, we can start going through some of those. One of the questions here, will CARES Act loans be forgiven for essential businesses as well? Yes. So as it's set up, it doesn't appear to be limited. It's an odd thing because the idea is for businesses that are otherwise in jeopardy, they would be able to kind of cover payroll rather than close down. For growers, there is considered essential, and many of us are, we're still running, and if anything, there's greater demand than ever to produce fresh fruits and vegetables, things like that, to kind of keep people healthy. And so there doesn't seem to be any restriction on being able to use it for them. For non-essential businesses who may be shut down, they would actually probably not be eligible for things like the paycheck loans, because obviously they wouldn't really have ongoing payroll. They would be closed down. They wouldn't qualify for some of the disaster loans. Most of the ones that we'd flag, the kind of the 7A loans, the paycheck loans, things like that, that's more for ongoing expenses to the extent you're still up and running and still moving forward. Let's see, one of the questions was, oops, sorry. Try to cycle through these. Are the slides available? Yes, they are through United Ag. If an employee doesn't have COVID-19 or other reasons that trigger leave but is feeling comfortable working hours, do they qualify for unemployment even if we were offering employment? They would. So essentially in that scenario, they have, they're not treated as having quit. They would be laid off for not working the hours, and they should be eligible for immediate unemployment. So another part of the Family First Act beyond the paid leave was an expansion of the unemployment program. And there's additional funds that came in through the CARES Act out of that $2 trillion that covers that. So they would be eligible for unemployment benefits for that period. Let's see. More questions. Is the 80 hours above and beyond the California sick leave? It is. So potentially they could get, I think is it 3 and 24 in California? So that would be in addition to that. I'm not sure. We haven't heard from EDD or the people in California who would enforce that. If they could use those 3 days as part of the 2 weeks, but my understanding, in the law, they made clear that they do not preempt any of the state laws, and the DOL guidance is consistent with that. So the idea is that it should likely be in addition to that. So you would have to pay them under state law, and then the federal requirement would be reimbursed separately. So you wouldn't get reimbursement for the part where you're paying the California benefits, but you would for the federal. There's a question of whether this applies to a business with less than 20 employees for sick leave. It does. The only exemption is the one that we flagged for if you're fewer than 50 and having that worker go out because of the closed school scenario would jeopardize the business. That's the only exemption that's built in. There's no exemption for the sick leave, and there's nothing specific to the 20 under the federal law. So someone had reached out to SBA and disaster loan that both said that ag would not qualify for the paycheck protection. So through the website, you definitely do. There is a box that says you're not ag. On the Treasury form, and I think Treasury will be the ones to handle the paycheck protection part of it, the application does not have that restriction. And so that they should be, our understanding was that they should be eligible. That was the understanding of Congress when they passed it. We've talked to people on both the Small Business Committee and people on the Ag Committee, and this was something that they went to bat for and found that. So understanding is that when the doors open on April 3rd, that you should be eligible for it. We're going to keep monitoring it, and to the extent that there's any pushback or any problem with getting it, that's something that USDA may be able to step up and cover instead. But we'll keep an eye on it, but I believe that that's right. Let me see. Sorry, it's cycling through some of the questions. One of the questions was, in applying for PPP, how do we find a bank to do so, or online through SBA? Where's the Treasury application? I can send that to Maribel to push out as part of the news for that. It's essentially I believe it's treasury.gov. There should be a form on the main page that kind of has that link, and so it'll be the application form for look for paycheck protection. I believe it's still on the first page. That's they have questions about who's eligible, and then they have a link to the PDF version of the form right there. Can grandparents apply for unemployment benefits if they're taking care of grandkids due to school closures? Parents have essential jobs. They could, yes. So they would not be eligible if you employ the grandparent. They would not be eligible for the 2/3 paid leave through you. But if they had to be laid off for that, they should still be eligible for unemployment because of it. And then, but to the previous question about finding a bank. So any of the lenders that work with SBA should be available to cover that part of it. So most of the 7A loans and kind of the operating loans like that go through private banks. But there'll be more guidance coming out from Treasury as far as kind of how that money will actually flow through specific local lenders or as direct payments from Treasury. Let me see. So the presentation will be available on the United Ag's website. Here we go. Sorry. Y'all are faster at typing than I am at talking, so well done. Is the first 2 weeks or 10 days of family leave paid? Previously is unpaid, and 10 weeks are paid at 2/3. So for the 2 weeks, I believe the employee has the ability to use paid time from the company to cover that gap. But it otherwise will be paid at 2/3, but they would have the ability to essentially buy that extra 1/3 by using paid leave that they have available. But I believe it's paid from day one, for including that initial 2 weeks for the situation where their child is home from school. Would applying for other disaster relief loans or grants prevent us from qualifying for paycheck protection? It shouldn't, no. The two are separate. The things that this can go to, the paycheck protection is limited as to what it can cover, and as the name suggests, it's specific to payroll, whereas the other things can cover paying mortgages or loans that you have, or equipment purchases or input purchases, things like that. So that should be different. And so having the one shouldn't close the door to the other. Our unemployment benefits increased. How do we get employees to come to work versus just apply for unemployment? Well, two things. They are increased, and that was one of the concerns. There were a number of Republican senators that held out in voting for the bill over that concern. Essentially, they would still need to be laid off to get the unemployment, though, so they wouldn't have the option just to quit and take that. If you were offering them pay, they would have to keep coming in. But that it's a concern that we'll see that there would be eligibility for that, and that the time eligibility is expanded and the amounts have increased and the waiting period has shrunk. The idea is that there are a certain number of people. I think yesterday Macy's laid off 125,000 people coast to coast. There are people that their businesses are just shut down, that they're in a little bit different boat right now than ag. And so there are people that are just out of work and need that money right away. But for people that are still able to work and actually in some cases really need people to work to be able to keep growing, we'll see kind of to the extent that people take that option or not. Let's see, this is the SBA. New question. What if we don't lay off employee, but they just don't want to come in due to concerns of COVID? Yeah, a few people have asked that. Either they're afraid to be out in the world, or to go to a workplace specifically. It's not covered. That's not one of the 6 factors. So there would not be paid time off for that. There's no paid leave for that. If they don't come in, then potentially they would be. You would have the option to lay them off for refusing to work their shift, and then they would be eligible for unemployment to cover that. But it's not technically covered by the Family First part of it, the paid leave provision of that. If there are more questions, keep sending them in. But one thought as far as kind of worksite safety, this is a little bit beyond the Family First or the CARES Act, but something that we're hearing a lot about. Sort of efforts that people are going through to try to ensure that social distancing, maintaining that 6-foot radius around everybody. It can be challenging in some situations, if people are working on, say, a belt operation, picking lettuce or something like that, they maybe closer together. There may be room to spread people out. If they're in strawberry rows, kind of do every other row or something like that and kind of adjust how things are handled that way. People that are in H2A, obviously you're providing housing to them. There was just guidance out today, probably about 15 minutes before we started talking, from the Office of Foreign Labor Certification, saying that to the extent that for COVID-related reasons you need to adjust your housing, either add more housing so that you can spread people out more, or God forbid somebody's tests COVID positive, and so you need to either remove them from the housing or remove everybody from the housing and sanitize, kind of sterilize the housing location again. There's flexibility built into that. You can just send a notice to Chicago and then work with EDD or your local state workforce agency as far as getting inspected after the fact the locations that you move workers to. And so there are options. They're kind of building in some of the flexibility to handle that. To the extent that people have H2A workers that they're trying to bring in and there have been delays because the consulates in Mexico, for example, have closed, they are working on, there are multiple solutions to that. The State Department has a program where they will do a visa interview waiver. So rather than have everybody come in, which they normally would come in face-to-face with the consulate officer, they can waive if they've been in the country on a visa anytime in the last 4 years and they otherwise qualify for the waiver. So they have a clean record and they've been interviewed at some point, things like that. There are different factors that weigh in. So, but it is possible to keep processing workers into the country despite that shutdown at the consulate. USDA and DOL are working on a partnership to identify workers that are already in the U.S. that are maybe coming off a contract or maybe available. And so they're identifying the employers, at least, for whom they work, so that you could reach out to one of them and say, like, I see that you have workers that are finishing a contract. I need 20, 40, 100 people. Can we work out a transfer so that they would stay in the country and move over? We're working with USCIS on ways to improve flexibility on things like that, on transfers, new hires, on being able to bring workers in. To the extent that companies have, ranch or farm has H2A workers already, and due to market conditions, we're seeing this more in kind of nursery landscape or nursery greenhouse operations a little bit more than food, but if some of the shipper operations start kind of winding down some of their contracts, they may not need all of the growing workers that they had hired. There is an option to what they call contract impossibility. So you reach out to the Department of Labor and say, I don't need the set of workers that I thought I did because of the virus. And so there's a setup. The round one from DOL covered exactly that. There's a way to reach out to them. We're looking at a way that growers can say, rather than shut down the whole contract, you may be able to just operate at maybe half power. And so if you brought in 100 workers, but say you only need 50, and so again, with the 3-quarter guarantee, you have to promise a certain number of hours. If you need a smaller workforce, then maybe you could let go half of the workers and either try to place them with someone else who's already in the U.S. with another grower, or pay for their travel back home to end that. So these are some of the things we're looking at. On some of the other safety training for ag employees, encouraging social distancing, definitely support that. I know that there are some groups who are doing things like giving out hand sanitizer to the workers or having break times to wash hands in the field, things like that. We don't have the specific guidance on that. It's really kind of unique to each industry and each crop activity. But generally speaking, would reference the CDC guidelines, speaks generally to kind of social distancing ideas on how to maintain a 6-foot radius. There's good specific language on the DOL site. I think it's just dol.gov/coronavirus, and that will link to some of the OSHA guidance and what they're recommending specific to the work site to keep workers safe in that situation. The housing density changes, so they don't, there are a couple questions on this. So the DOL didn't specifically reference, they aren't applying the CDC guidelines, but as far as the housing, just to the extent that you feel the need to kind of add more housing to kind of keep distances or to respond to an infection situation, they're just increasing flexibility as far as adding new housing locations, but they don't have any specific requirements around changing your approved housing to accommodate more people or more space per person. we're calling employees back and some are choosing to stay on unemployment. Is there anything we do to get them back to work? Unfortunately, not really. I mean, it's kind of, it's their option. I mean, if there's an offer of employment that they turn down, to the extent that that's handled through the unemployment office, potentially that could end their benefits, but there really isn't a way to get them to come back directly. Let me see if there's any questions in here I've missed. If anybody, I don't know if there's a way to unmute people, if anybody wants to ask one over the phone. Let me see. If I have part-time workers who are laid off right now and I bring back during any time from now to December 2020, are they subject to getting 80 hours? They would be. So that if you bring somebody, so all of the leave provisions will end at the end of the calendar year. Again, if things are then, which hopefully they aren't, if things are still as they are now, we would expect that they would expand that. But, you know, as it's written now, that was just sort of the farthest horizon they could think of as the end of the year. And so that was set up to cover all of them. And so, but whenever they come in, whether they've been with you before or not, if they've not used their time, they should get that new 2-week period. On the poster that we mentioned, there's a model poster that's available from the Department of Labor. That's on that dol.gov/coronavirus. You look under, there's a section there that talks about the Family First Act, and so that's there. There's a notice there. I believe they have it in English and Spanish now. Originally, it was only available in English, and so that covers both. And so for people that are working from home, the wording in the statute is just that it's posted in a conspicuous location. That's the phrase they use. So it's probably a good practice to, if you have people that are teleworking, to send it out to them so that, say they're teleworking now, but then they become sick so they're not able to telework either, then that would be relevant to them. And then as far as kind of how it's documented, different groups have put out forms. There's no official form from any of the agencies that say that requires a worker to sign a thing or something like that that says, I am sick, I was diagnosed by this, so forth. So there are a lot of questions about what kind of proof is needed. There's no specific form. It can be helpful, I mean, to the extent that IRS asks later for you to back up proof that, you know, you say that you paid leave for these 10 workers and that they were out, you know, just send us something that backs up why they took that leave. So there's some documentation that's required, but they haven't really specified what that looks like. If somebody obviously is in one of those first 3 conditions where they're either in quarantine or believe that they have the disease, pretty obviously you don't want them coming into the office to do that, but doing something by email or even over the phone where, you know, somebody in the office writes it down and takes notes and kind of gathers some of that information that way. Or failing that, you know, that since it's only for a 2-week window, you know, to the extent that they're healthy enough to come in later, 2 things, you know, they can complete the documentation there. Since the FICA payments are usually only done on a quarterly basis, you should have some time before you would have to do that reporting to IRS. But also, it's even under the FMLA or the Americans with Disability Act, it's okay to ask for essentially a cleared to work letter from their doctor, something that says they are no longer symptomatic and they are no longer contagious and they are available to return to work. So you can get that kind of all clear letter from a medical professional before you let them back to the work site. Again, not to punish them or anything or to limit their pay, but just to protect the safety of both your workers and your crops so that they're not infecting the food stream there. So, you know, the key to all of that is flexibility. You know, there isn't any specific requirement that they, you know, if they don't provide it, then you aren't allowed to withhold the paid leave. But again, with this 30-day non-enforcement period, DOL is understanding that, look, we are very clearly in uncharted waters here. You know, this is beyond anything that so it's fair game to, you know, if they find that you did something wrong, you know, should have paid, didn't pay on time or something like that, then they will give you a chance to make it right without kind of throwing the book at you. So that's the good news in the short term. And IRS the same. I believe that, you know, if they have questions about the documentation, they're really, the intent of this from Congress was to really take care of workers who are having a hard time right now, and then we'll figure out the rest later. And the amount of money involved shows that they are not looking to nickel and dime anybody. You know, $2 trillion is it's a pretty good chunk of money. So the idea is to kind of take care of people. more questions here. Process for the exemption for the sick leave and the 12 weeks under FMLA. You have to apply for the exemption, do the required posting. So there's the regular FMLA, the time off, and so that's unpaid leave. So that's for any conditions that are separate from the coronavirus illness. So it could be that it's not clear how the two interact. So say somebody is diagnosed, so they're in one of those first three conditions, they actually have coronavirus and they take the 2 weeks off, but they're still sick or they're still for some reason unable to come back because they're weakened by that experience and so they can't come back. They may be eligible for FMLA. That could be a qualifying sickness for that. And so they would be eligible for unpaid time for a period of time after that. And let's see, is it okay to have an employee working part-time from home and receive the balance of an 8-hour day from paid leave and 4 hours for work paid leave? 4 hours work, 4 hours paid leave, yes. So there's room to kind of adjust schedules, and so it really is, to the extent that they can work from home, then that's just paid as regular wages, period, and so that doesn't qualify. But then to the extent there's another part of the day where they would have been working but for those conditions, then again, that could be caring for their child or so forth, then they'd be eligible for that. In the situation where it's because of a school closing, for example, so they can telework for half the day and then for 4 hours they are unable to, then they would get full pay for the time when they're actually working, and then obviously only the 2/3 pay for the time that's the paid leave time. But that part of it would be compensable back through the payment portions of the Family First Act.
So Chris, it's 10:53. I know questions are still coming in, and I know there will be some questions after when you're done, and like, oh, I should have asked this. So any of those questions come up later, feel free to reach out to us. And as Chris when he first started, he said, we would like to hear from you too. So part of what Chris helps us with is not just giving you the information, but also getting feedback from you so they can go back on our behalf and make some of these things that we need from an industry standpoint. Right, Chris? So we had, at United Ag, there's an email called advocacy@unitedag.org. So it's advocacy@unitedag.org. So feel free to send your questions, concerns, anything that you have, so we can compile all that information and pass it to Chris and Lynn. And so when they are talking to the legislators out there and impacting the federal issues, they have some of the concerns from our industry, right, from a membership. So feel free to do that. And also any questions that come up after this, please let us know. Chris, this was really very informative, especially the paycheck loans. I know some of the feedback that I've heard from our membership is the impact on from a financial standpoint, right? So that would be helpful. I do have a few follow-up questions on that, and I will follow up with you so we can have that posted on our website. You said that would be waived or forgiven, and I just need more details on that and how that will kind of take place in implementation standpoint. So we'll reach back to you on that. But with that, any closing comments from you, Chris, and then Maribel can monitor the questions coming in, and we can pass it along and make sure they get all answered.
Absolutely, and there will be more questions and there's more information that, I gave a similar presentation of this the end of last week, and most of the slides have already changed from then as we get more information from the agencies. So it's really a matter of we all need to kind of keep checking back to the key agency websites at DOL, USDA, and Treasury, just to see what they're doing. And then just sort of by definition, or by being in this group and participating in United Ag, that commitment to providing healthcare to your workers and all the telehealth that they're taking care of for everybody right now, you're already in that kind of elite group of people that are doing things the right way. And beyond that, kind of joining webinars and taking time out of your busy day to listen to this and find out how best to take care of your workers, you guys are doing it right. And so when we go into the agencies and we say, you know, United Ag feels strongly about this, that carries a lot of weight because they know that you guys are doing it right. And so if you're seeing something, that's something they're going to take seriously. So if you see anything, please pass that on, and you can be a tremendous resource to the people in government that are trying right now to help people get through this.
Good point. Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining, and stay in touch, and please reach out to us if there's anything that we can do. We would love to help because this is a really difficult time for all of us. So reach out to us, and through different avenues, even direct emails to me works, or our marketing team, or advocacy@unitedag.org. And also this Friday, so this is from a federal standpoint on some of the issues impacting us from a federal standpoint. On Friday, we have another webinar that talks about, we'll have a similar presentation from a state standpoint. So please tune into that to hear more from a state standpoint on what some of the issues impacting us are. So thank you.